In the wake of Russiagate, U.S. President Donald Trump's recent meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, turning the Cold War fever gripping Washington, D.C. and corporate newsrooms around the country up to 11. When combined with the approval on Wednesday by Congress of the latest annual defense authorization bill to the tune of $717 billion U.S. tax dollars, the calls for peace before bombs are definitely being drowned out of the foreign policy discussion like never before, with corporate Democrats and Republicans alike reaching post-9/11, pre-Iraq war nationalist fervor. It's important to remember that there are still voices calling for peace and an end to imperialism. One of those voices is former 2016 Green Party vice presidential candidate and national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace, Ajamu Baraka, who recently joined us from Cali, Colombia. We started by asking Mr. Baraka, why are we seeing such pushback against peace organizations like his? And what does that say about the political activist culture here in the U.S.?
I think, unfortunately, what it represents is that when you look at the general trajectory of U.S. opinion, political opinion, ideals, culture, you see a steady, consistent move to the right over the last 4 decades. And so it is understandable that along with that sort of a general move toward the right, we find that the so-called left has also moved toward the right. So what we have in the U.S. today is a politics of collaboration in very real ways. That is, people who still define themselves as left still find themselves on the same side of U.S. intervention. They still see themselves taking positions that 40 years ago would have been called out for being a rightist position. So, you know, that is part of the pushback against our efforts and against the attempts to try to rebuild the anti-war movement here in this country. They want us to be on the same side of U.S. intervention. We instead take a position that our responsibility is to oppose interventions, to respect international law as it relates to national sovereignty, to respect the principles of self-determination, and to allow for people to decide for themselves how they attempt to govern themselves or even make political change. Our responsibility is to make sure that this state is not operating in our names, systematically violating the human rights of people around the world.
NBC coverage, I think this is a really important thing that we have to talk about, covered Stormy Daniels over 400 times, compared next to zero coverage of the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. And so we asked Ajamu what important issues are being ignored or forgotten in the media's obsession over Donald Trump and Russiagate.
One of the things that we've been trying to call attention to is the fact that while the elements of corporate media, along with Democrats and powerful elements in the state, have been keeping the attention on the personality of Donald Trump, his theatrics. There's been a continuation of governance in the U.S. and governance that has resulted in policies that have had a measurable negative impact and will have in the future on ordinary working class people in the U.S. There wasn't much debate, for example, around the Trump proposals to cut taxes, both individuals and corporate taxes. There wasn't much discussion in the corporate press around the obscene proposal by the Trump administration to expand the military budget at one point by $54 billion that ended up being $80 billion, in which both Republicans and Democrats fell in line with in terms of support. There's not been much real discussion around a number of the policies that have been implemented that have continued the policies of the last 4 decades that have been undermining the objective interests of working people. And we see that there's been no change in the bipartisan commitment or understanding that the way the U.S. is going to maintain its influence, its hegemony, is through the use of military force. In fact, we've seen that from the Democrat side, even those minimal efforts on the part of the Trump administration to de-escalate tensions with various countries, including Russia, that administration has been faced with pushback itself, with almost a crazed obsession on escalating tensions and creating a political environment in which direct military confrontation could be the inevitable consequence. So, you know, it's been a continuation of the same kinds of policies, very dangerous policies. And these policies have been basically bipartisan policies, rupture with reality. That I think is even more dangerous than the post 9/11 situation or environment. I think the only historic comparison that we can make, and I think legitimately, is the McCarthy era, where basically there was this attempt to impose a kind of political and ideological conformity on the American people. That any opposition to the sort of groupthink that was resulting in the mobilization of public opinion against the Soviet Union and against ideas of progress and socialism and communism was to be seen as embracing the enemy and to be seen as treason. We see the same kind of irrationality in place today, where basically if you raise questions about the dominant narrative of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, you are to be questioned. If you suggest that there are questions that are legitimate concerning the role of NATO, if you question the advisability of maintaining a connection or U.S. policies in Syria, then you are to be questioned. You know, there seems to be an environment in which irrationality is the only acceptable route to go. And it's very because it means that critical voices that are needed to raise questions and to make sure that we don't have a complete departure from objective reality. More and more people are becoming intimidated. They're failing to speak out about the collaboration between the intelligence agencies and the private sector, and the result being that they have made it more difficult for people to receive critical information, for information to be disseminated through the internet, social media, and that there's been a sort of a narrowing of acceptable perspectives that has a very visible impact on the character and the nature of democratic practice and democratic ideals here in this country.